You are listening to My Little Narcissist. I'm your host, Lyra Stone, and I'm going to talk to you today and dive a little deeper into kind of my personal abuse story and sort of share some insights and thoughts into what actual abuse looks like, what narcissism is, why we stay, and some of kind of the addressment of those cliche questions that are often asked. And I'm hoping that by kind of making it a little more personal for me, that it will kind of also speak to you, because I do think there is obviously a universality to what happens with victims of abuse. Like, I think a big one in some ways is people, when they hear about abuse or they observe abuse or you tell them about abuse, especially if it's with a narcissistic person, they will often focus on the personalities of the individuals involved. Like, they'll be like, well, that can't be you. This couldn't have happened to you. You're confident, or you're outspoken, or you're this with us, and he's this with us, and therefore it can't. Because they don't understand that abuse is insidious. Abuse does not have a personality type necessarily assigned to it. Like NPD, I feel like everybody, when they think of NPD or they think of narcissistic personality disorder, persons who are narcissistic, they kind of get in their minds, a very stereotypical picture of, well, I would think of, say, Donald Trump, a very grandiose, very self-delusional, bullying, all about himself, posturing, lying, he's just so overbearing. And, everybody's met that personality type, that kind of cliche Hollywood stereotype, typical person who's just very self-consumed. And that becomes sort of almost the problem, because people just think of the stereotype. They don't understand that this is a disorder. I mean, none of us, most of us, I should say, are not psych majors or have extensively studied psychology. We only have a cursory knowledge of these things. And when we start studying the actual personality disorders and their roots and what manifests and what it looks like, even people who have been studying it can still find themselves in an abusive situation with a narcissistic person and not even know, because they will not even manifest or display a lot of these things until later. And then by that point, you kind of have confirmation bias. Maybe you're a little codependent, or, we have rose-colored glasses on that we all do when we bond in a relationship, when we commit to relationships, if we're normal at least, or maybe abnormal in that we are extra loyal, or we're extra loving, extra empathetic. And so when we bond. And I know for me, my relationships are very important. And when you kind of become a part of my circle, it's ride or die with me. I have loyalty to a fault, and I don't want to depict myself as some, moralistic saint, because honestly, some of that loyalty came down to codependency as well. I had a very unstable childhood. I had a very insecure background. So I would attach to relationships typically more strongly than I think most people would, because they were in many ways like a surrogate family to me. The relationships were very deep to me because I lacked structure. I lacked love. I lacked, I had a lot of neglect in my childhood and abuse in my childhood. Are you starting to see where that's going? It was, I could subsist off of very little love. And so, yes, I was very loyal to my friends and to my families that I would create. And, and I don't think I'm alone in that. I think that there's a lot of people out there who just love so deeply, and some of it maybe for less selfish reasons than mine, because mine was out of a place of fear. It was out of a place of abandonment, of not being alone, of not having the kind of stability that other people might have, of I can rely on. And people who come from poor families or things that where there's just a lot of circumstances. This is very common. But anyway, so you might not see just what the person, the narcissist, the abuser is until a lot later than, you might have if you hadn't have bonded with them so strongly. Because at first, when anybody's in a relationship, there's going to be compromises. Say you go on a trip. Well, there's going to be, 20 decisions that have to be made in that trip, probably just within the first 3-5 hours. When are we going to stop at a rest stop? Where are we going to go eat? What should we do when we get there? Most people, there'd be a compromise, like there'd be a gauge. You'd look at the group and you'd be like, okay, well, how do you feel? Well, I feel kind of tired. Okay, well, let's go to the hotel then, and we can unpack and we can rest for a little bit, and then we'll go out. Or, ooh, I feel really hungry, or I feel really energized. Oh, if you feel energized, I don't know, I don't really have it in me, I'm kind of hungry. And then you come up with compromises, right? Seems pretty simple, especially if you love a person, and hopefully you're compatible with that person, and so it won't be too much of an issue to find things that you can all enjoy without too much of a sacrifice of one person or another. And that becomes the problem. And when my abuser, for like this example, when we went on trips in the beginning, I was actually the one that typically scheduled things and, kind of led things. And I was very, very compromising. What would you like? Where would you like to go? Etc. But he had control issues, very serious control issues. And so as we went on trips more and more, as he became more confident, so to speak, he suddenly wanted to be the one that, drove. He wanted to be the one that decided, and that's fine. I can then just be in the supportive role, and, but then the whole what do you want thing wouldn't be asked. In fact, it would be pushed away, and it would be diminished, and it became really, really, really bad with him because, if I was, say, injured. One time I was in a car accident, and we were going to go to a city nearby the next day. And because I was in a car accident, I had a pretty serious neck injury where I couldn't move my head more than a few inches left or right because, car accidents are scary. But he insisted we go on the trip. We had to go on the trip because this trip was important to him. And, as I think back, like that, for example, and, me being in tears, not able to even move my head, and him not resenting me and saying, hurry up. This would be an example of somebody who clearly lacks empathy, very entitled, very selfish. I actually burst into tears at one point because that was in the beginning, and I was like, this is too much for me. What is wrong with you? What is wrong with you? I remember just being like, what is wrong with you? Because it was the moment where I was like, something is wrong with you. Because I love you and I'm doing this, but you're making me feel so bad for having been in a car accident. And I think this is very common for people in general, women and men aren't believed for things. They both have their gender stereotypical problems. I know for me as a woman, I feel like if I say I'm sick, people are going to label me as a hysteric or as a hypochondriac or something. So I'm always questioning whether my feelings are even valid, like whether this ailment I'm experiencing is even real. And this is a problem, of course. It's like for women, I know men can also have other genderized stereotypical issues, but for me, that's a very large concern. So here I am with a neck problem, and because of him diminishing it and him saying, well, it's not really that bad. You only bashed your head into the windshield and the car was totaled, but, it's not really that bad. And I'm hearing this person that I love and I trust and I want to believe telling me it's not that bad, but really what he's saying is, don't ruin this situation for me. And I only bring it up because it starts there. The grooming will start there. And this was pretty early in the relationship. And I should have said, it is bad. How dare you? I will not go on this trip. And, he probably would have gotten upset and we would have broken up and that would have been all she wrote. But I didn't want to lose him. And I wanted to be in a relationship with him. He made me feel safe and comfortable and happy in a way I had never felt before when we first started going out. It felt like I had met my soulmate. It felt like we were just perfect for each other. And I was not going to give that up. I was just so happy. This is what I wanted. My parents were monogamous. They have always been together. My grandparents have always been together. I just come from this long line of you pair bond. And when you find that spark, that's it. And I pair bonded. I found the spark. And so I was like, yes. I compromised with it. But for the record, I also fought back against it. And I said, no, no, no. It's weird how boundaries work, because if, they will only agree as long as there's a consequence they don't want to suffer yet. They have to keep chipping away at the consequence, chipping away at your self-worth, chipping away at your sanity, so that next time they can maybe get away with it and there won't be as much of a punishment, or there won't be as much as a reaction, because they gauge everything. It's just kind of how they think. They will do anything and everything they want to you if they can get away with it. And so when people try to blame the victim and say, well, you should have, not let him get away with it, what needs to be understood is they've been psychologically doing this to you for years and 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 years. It didn't start out with him strangling you and raping you and doing the things that I ended up being subjected to in the end of the relationship. It started out with things like that. Oh, your neck is brutally injured from a major car accident you had, and we have to go do this trip. And your comfort, your safety is not important to me. Another trip, I was so exhausted. There was also an issue of I wasn't allowed to be tired. He had a lot of energy, and I couldn't. And these are like things that couples would typically complain about. It's like, man, my husband was such a jerk. He really wanted to go see this car show, and I was just so tired, and he wouldn't listen to me, and he forced me to do it, and I resent him. Things like that. That sounds like a kind of normal couple thing. With him, though, it went beyond simply like, oh, you selfish jerk, and then he says, you're right, that was selfish, and then, and then the next day he like makes it up to her and takes her out to, a Valentine's Day special or something. You know how it is. And then hopefully you're fine, because sometimes people are selfish, and sometimes people do get resentful, but there's eventually a return. There's a listening. There's a stopping point. But with him, there was no stopping point. There was no moment of, oh, I did that bad thing. No, there was just more insistence. I will never forget the degree of fatigue, of not being allowed to rest, not being allowed to stop. I was visiting with a relative of his who was cruel, a mean person. And I would actually hide in the bathroom and sit in a stall and close my eyes and just nod off for maybe 20, 30 seconds. And then come back out and try to smile and put on as much of a positive impression as I can when I am dizzy with fatigue. And being afraid, because by that point, because that was probably about a year and a half in, I knew that to really push or cause a disruption was going to get a big tantrum. I was going to get punishment. And silent treatment was a very big one for him. And I didn't like silent treatment, so... But again, I could have, it also came down to a fear of abandonment, of course. And, the funny thing is people wield things against you. They will wield your insecurities against you. And if they're good people, they won't do that, unless they really feel like they're embattled. And that's usually when, you'll see just the normal divorced couple that start wielding your weaknesses against you because they're getting a divorce, and one of them feels betrayed, both of them feels betrayed. Divorce gets ugly, because that's when they can start pulling out each other's most vulnerable spots, the things that they used to trust each other with. But with a narcissistic abuser, those vulnerabilities and weaknesses are being pulled out all the time. There's no holding back. But you, on the other hand, you cannot retaliate. If you retaliate with any of that, it's going to be such a big deal. It's going to be met with even a tiny retaliation. This person, for example, was very critical. I couldn't even no matter how well-meaning it was, tell him, oh, hey, your hair is getting kind of long. You should probably go get a haircut. Like that's a simple thing, right? I couldn't say something like that to him because he would hear, your hair looks disgusting, how dare you, you need to get a haircut, you're so worthless, would be basically what he would hear. And so I would not be allowed to say those things. He, on the other hand, it was very expected and common for him to put whatever demands he possibly wanted and needed on me, and I needed to be complicit and compliant. Because if I did a good job, which is again conditioning and grooming, if I did a good job, he would be pleasant, he would be nice, and it would feel like he was when we first fell in love. Because when we first fell in love, I really liked that person. I loved that person. That person was so compatible with me. And it felt so harmonious. And the way he would depict himself was basically, he would basically be like, I'm a little broken. I'm a little vulnerable right now. You have to do these things. And if you do these things, then I will be in a good mood. And I'm putting that on you to do. Now, a healthy person wise, you shouldn't be required to be somebody's source of light and happiness. That's not acceptable. That is a violation of boundaries. It's disrespectful. And another thing that he started to do would be censor my words. For example, respect was a word that very quickly I was not allowed to say. So if he was being, intolerable and tyrannical and manipulative, I would say, you're being very disrespectful. And that became a taboo word. You can't use it. It became a word that he thought was frivolous, was hysterical, was over the top. And it's the ways, like, I can't even begin to explain, it's the ways in which it's twisted. It makes you feel ashamed. It makes you feel small, stupid, hysterical. Like, basically, I felt every time I stated just a normal human need, I would feel like I was being too much, because he made me feel that way. And even though it should have been obvious how disproportionate it was, because me, for example, sleeping on the couch for 2 years because he needed the bed a certain way and the lights a certain way in our very small one-bedroom apartment, that was a ridiculous sacrifice for me to make, but it was expected to be made. And, it really caused me to have some pretty bad back issues as a result. And, that was difficult, not having a room at the time when we did that for 2 years. And that's not even really getting into the eventuality of physical violence and of rape. And, that would start out as sexual coercion. Like, for example, at first, there was a lot of sex. And then, when conflicts arise, maybe there's a little less. But he was insistent it had to keep happening. And if I wasn't in the mood, as people often aren't, I had to be. There became less and less of a way for me to get out of it without being punished, without, once again, disruption to the normalcy of life, to kindness, to stability, because he would make sure that my life would become unstable, that I would be abandoned, that I would be made to feel bad. And then, eventually it became even more like a guilt trip. Like, it helps me sleep. Well, it's really not a whole lot on your end. And then, it starts out that way. And, frankly, when it comes to sex, if your partner's not even enjoying it, there was no even connection or level to, is she enjoying it, or is this even, it wasn't even an issue or a concern for him. But there was a lot of ego involved in it. But then eventually it got a little worse, and then it got a little worse, and then it just became about control and power and inflicting pain. And you are so battered down by this point that you just, because they keep telling you it's not really happening, or it's minor, or it's small. And what really needs to be understood as all this is going on, and this is just between you and the person, you have the person's mother, you have the person's friends, you have a business together by this point. You have a house together. A lot of times when it comes to abusers, you have children by this point. Abusers can often really look good and be nice for a year or two, which is usually the courtship before people get engaged and get married. And, and then they have children, sometimes accidentally, because, a lot of times there can be coercion involved, and they will do that kind of, as a tactic. And then you're just like, as soon as it's just like a light bulb goes off, and now you're trapped. You have to work with that. This is a partnership. This is a bond that you've committed to. And if you don't, and you love them, and it's complicated. And I didn't have children with this man, so there was that working for me. But I had so many other things by that point. And and who he was with his friends and family was so starkly different. And at first I thought that made me special. When he was more intimate and vulnerable with me in the beginning, it made me feel special. It's like, wow, he shares these parts of himself with only me. His other friends don't see him when he's insecure. His other friends don't see him when, he struggles with these neuroses, because he's a very neurotic man, like very neurotic. And at first it made me feel special, but ultimately it was, again, just grooming. He was grooming me. And his friends and family knew so very little of him. His family even, which I find so strange, that a mother and a father going to their house, it was like it was like a play. It was like a work of fiction. Just very stodgy, formal. His mother, he was the golden child. She just worshipped the ground he walked on. And he was just very laid back and, even keel, sort of. Maybe he would always counterbalance his mother's hysterics, even though he himself was very similar to his mother in many, many respects. He had a lot of emotional issues and control issues, just like she did. And his dad was, avoidant. He was disassociative. I didn't see a lot of affection from his father ever directed at him. I can psychologically analyze his family. I'm not going to. But, it was just like being around his friends. He had nice, kind of nerdy friends who'd known him a long time. Like, it seemed so bizarre. How can I tell a friend of his who only knows him as this just laid back, nerdy person? How do I tell them how I spent, 4 days at home because my face was too bruised to go out in public? Or that, he had raped me so consistently and for so long and so brutally that I was incontinent and couldn't go into work? How do I tell people that he had strangled me to the point how do I tell people how bad it is when I, first off, can't believe it myself, because he would act like it didn't exist, or if it did, it wasn't that big of a deal. If it was a big of a deal, then you deserved it. The classic kind of abuser mantra. I felt so trapped, and I knew if I said anything, what was actually happening. Because sometimes I would hint, I would test the waters. I think a lot of abuse victims do, where they'll hint at things. Maybe they'll show a bruise on the arm. Like, I would show a bruise, be like, yeah, something small, just to see how it'll, and most of the responses were dismissive or were slightly concerned, but not really. One was definitely victim blaming. It was very victim blaming. She was like, well, you have a nice boyfriend and I don't, so you should just make it work and deal with it. That doesn't even sound like him. I've dealt, so we test waters. All abuse victims do. We all do. And to be honest, there's not a lot of safety out there. There's not a lot of people willing to, I think, help you vocalize it. Actually, I can't think of anybody that did help me. Not that it was their responsibility, but I knew that if I said it, there would be no hope. Because if I told anyone and I came out about it, then he would never forgive me, and he would never change, and he would never go back to the wonderful person I fell in love with, and the person that still would pop out on occasion. And you know, I do have to say, when it comes to abuse, the trauma bond is, of course, very severe. It's like a dope sickness. I would kind of equate. I truly believe that the happiest, most fulfilled, most enlightened way of living is by dedicating yourself to something outside of yourself, like God, community, a purpose, your country, things like that. And, people die for those things because they are so important to them. They understand that this is greater, this idea, this entity, this thing that, has kind of gotten all of humanity to where they're at now. This is more important than just us. And I've felt that way. It's how I was raised. It's how I believe. It's a core part of me. And abusive people, narcissists, and like covert narcissists is what I had, but narcissists are like this. They like to siphon that impulse off of people and put it inside of themselves and basically say, I am God. I am community. I am those things. Give your light, give your energy, give your will unto me. And when you love them, at first you'll resist, and you keep resisting in various fashions and forms, but it is an instinct inside of you. And it also becomes very sick, because when you give your life and your love and your energy to, say, God or community, yes, there's going to be pain there, but also the result is peace of mind, is happiness. It's a feeling of love, of being fulfilled because you are actively helping, and it's a great feeling. And but with narcissistic abusers, what you get as you give them these things, it's like an unholy inversion. You get shame, you get guilt, you get worthlessness. You basically inherit their karma. And I really believe that narcissists kidnap and coerce people to inherit their own karma. And that's why it can kill you. That's why you can get very confused. That's why a lot of victims cannot separate themselves in their mind from their abusers. They often blame themselves or even think of themselves as the abuser, and that has to be talked about too. Abusers blame you. Abusers are perpetual victims. Everything that happens to you is your fault. And you're like, how can you believe that? How can any woman or man believe, that strangulation is their fault? And, it's just over time, it builds up. When you get such a severe reaction for a minor thing, and then when you, from what you did, and then when you vocalize something very minor, and you don't get a reaction at all, it's conditioning, where you literally start to equate not putting the toilet seat down, or let me think of a better example. Not putting the toilet seat down to strangulation, and it being the same offense, the same sin, so to speak. That is how bad the brainwashing can get. And the thing is like, for me, when I finally had enough, I was getting very sick, as you could imagine, and I was going to go see a therapist, and going into therapy was a big step for me. And I basically said to him, I showed him some clips of how bad he had gotten, and these were really bad clips. And of course, I was coming from a place of love and a place of hope. I was like, this has to stop. I've tried everything I can think of with you. We've been together now for 9-8 years. Like, this has to stop, or I am leaving. And, he was, of course, more upset that I had these clips. And I really did try to do it from a good place. It wasn't from a coercive place. It wasn't from a place of, and because you already knew you cannot ever, with a narcissistic person, do ultimatums. Don't ever even attempt an ultimatum with them. You are going to, you put yourself in extreme danger when you do ultimatums. They do not. My ex, because he was controlling, obviously psychopathic even. A man is dead because of him. That's how. And I'm not going to go into that, but there's literally he literally has blood on his hands because of his lack of empathy, his lack of remorse, his impulse control issues, and I don't actually fully know what transpired that led to that man's death, except to say that none of us will ever know. But yeah, he had such behavioral issues. I had to get it. I was like, this is not, I'm scared. And he was mostly upset about the clips, and I deleted all of them in front of him. It's like, that's not the point. I'm not doing an ultimatum. I know how you feel about control, because losing control, even a little bit of control over their victim, will lead them to spiral, and you will be in serious risk. And I was really tired of cleaning up glass out of my carpets, because he loved to break things. Sometimes when I was there, sometimes when I wasn't there, I'd just come home to broken dishes and broken chairs and broken tables and broken doors. And again, these are things I couldn't tell people. And for the record, by that point, I wasn't going to let him do it anymore. I was like, you can't do it anymore. I'm not going to let you do it anymore. No, 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 no. And this is where victims often end up hating themselves or blaming themselves. Because once you say no, you put down a boundary, and now you're going to defend that boundary. With me, I wasn't going to let him sexually abuse me anymore. I wasn't going to allow him to physically abuse me anymore. I wasn't going to allow him to gaslight me anymore. I was very, resolved. And I was like, I am going to leave. We're going to get to mediation. This will be resolved in one way or another, and you will not hurt me anymore. But of course, what does that mean? That means that you are now in resistance, that you are reacting to abuse. And if at any point he made any kind of threat or gesture, I would put up my fist and be like, I'm ready for it, go. Because I was ready to fight back. And reaction to abuse, if it even is one time, they will say, see, I'm the victim. She's attacking me. It wasn't me. She just was doing it all to me, and I was just in a really bad situation. She was just manipulating and controlling me, and it can be really awful, because you are now, I was not going to let it happen anymore. And as a result, he instantly, when he saw that he no longer had control, that I wasn't going to be within that anymore. I mean, he started having affairs. He started triangulating friends and family, all sorts of things that was in fact him, but he would just change the names. He would just say, I'm a victim. Oh my goodness, this woman is hysterical. This woman's crazy. This woman's manipulative. This woman's a liar. This woman's abusive. And this is where abuse victims really start, because once you're in the he said, she said, once you're in the cycle, and so many of us, we're flabbergasted. It's like, for me, I wore so many long sleeves, and I covered up bruises. I went to my friend's wedding with bruises. When I thought about all the things that I covered up for, because you cover for them, like an enabler and a codependent will. And all of a sudden, this abusive person, because he's afraid he's going to be exposed, is just fabricating things. Or when you are in a bad situation where you're being strangled, and say you bite his arm or something, like to get him off you, because you have to push back, you have to react, you cannot be passive, especially when you're finally at this point where you're like, no, I won't, I will not. And this is often like with women, especially, like we're smaller often than men, and we have to be like, no. And really, it was the choice and decision I made. And I don't regret at all I'm very proud of myself for finally saying no. And I think that's in some ways what saved my life. Actually, I know that's what saved my life. It's what got me out. It's what unmasked him. Me standing up for myself and me being in resistance to any more conditioning. And they know. The really sad part is abusers will always know when that moment has hit. And for anybody that has gotten away from it, I'm sure we can all kind of attest to how truly frightening it is when their monstrous side is just out, where they have no reason to be nice, no reason to pretend anymore. Once you see a psychopath, a sociopath, a narcissistic person, once you see that them, when they have no reason to pretend to be human anymore, it is horrific and fascinating. The Jekyll Hyde is a great illustration of it, and I watched it with him, especially towards the end, when he would come home and it was like a robot deactivating. He had no reason to hide his complete disinterest in things outside of fuel sources or supply. It's hard to explain the eyes. It's really hard to explain the eyes. I know there's like pictures online, but it's not quite, you know it when you see it. And it is kind of like, they always say, well, there's no soul there. Yeah, it is kind of like there's no soul there. It's frightening. And when they want to actively destroy you, that's even more frightening. Because you see just how remorseless they are. And these are people, again, who, say 6 months ago, had their masks on and they were normal. They were happy. They were smiling. They looked normal-ish. It's weird because some outsiders in my relationship, actually many of them, would describe my ex-abuser as, a lot of them called him cold and off-putting. So clearly I didn't see some things that they did. And that is probably something I should also examine. But cold and off-putting is accurate. I just always thought of him as socially awkward and a little nerdy. But I think I was probably just making assumptions about him. But when you could spend so much time thinking about your abuser, and for the record, as I'm describing all the abuse, it also needs to be pointed out that that's only a small part of your life. It's a big part of your life, but, in addition to these things happening with this person that you're pair bonded with, that you are trauma bonded with, that you are attached to, you're living your life. I was in a band. I had a radio show. I was, running this company with him. I had an active social life. I was doing a lot of things, and I was taking day trips, and so there was like the social aspects, and then there's just everything in between. And we traveled all around the United States, all around. We had beautiful memories of trying barbecue in Kansas City. And, when he wasn't doing those things, which arguably he always was, but, those peaceful moments, and lots of people from abusive relationships talk about it. It's just like any other relationship in some regards. It's normal. It's happy. You're with somebody who knows you, that allegedly loves you. You're sharing in this memory, this experience. And, these are the things that tie you closer to someone too. When we have experiences and travels with one another, you bond with them. And that bond becomes tighter. So, you can imagine with me, I was with mine for almost a decade, and there was extensive travel and extensive bonding. And it was really difficult. And I think that when he got out of the mental ward after he kind of had his suicidal collapse when I kicked him out for an affair, because that was always my deal breaker. For everybody, it's funny with their deal breakers. With me, it was infidelity. To me, I will not and cannot accept it, and the betrayal and the disgust, especially because the woman was I had no respect for. So there was also just a lot of disgust there. And there were other women too, but these are the wonderful things you find out later. When I kicked him out, however, he did have a collapse. I think that covert narcissists especially can become very addicted to their supply. I think he didn't believe I ever would, and I did, and I had been trying, and I realized that there was just no way he was just going to keep me trapped, and it was just, I was dying. I actually believe I was dying. My body was shutting down. My body was shutting down. The amount of stress and strain of a man who was abandoning me in places, who was publicly humiliating me, the neglect and the sexual abuse especially, coupled with huge stunts of silent treatment. In the end, I felt so trapped and so helpless, and I didn't know what to do by that point. So I was like, I have to get out. Therapy, I have to get out. And so what I did, he just completely went crazy. And when he went crazy, I'd rather not go into what that's like, the implosion of your entire life, and what the damage a person is willing to do to save their own skin. I think he was afraid of going to prison. I didn't even cross my mind that I could send him to jail. Didn't even cross my mind to ever do that. To me, it seemed so nobody else's business but our own. And I know that seems nuts when there's a person who is, but that's just how I thought. That's how it was. And to be fair, the judicial system doesn't really do a whole lot for domestic violence survivors, or it's just really difficult to even get somebody prosecuted for that, even if it had occurred to me to go that direction. And that's another problem. Abuse victims often won't. This is their intimate partner. But when he got out, I think because the bond was so severe between the two of us, and I think he had been planning on murdering me for a while, actually. I think it had been a fantasy that he had been entertaining for a long time, because he couldn't stand the thought of me leaving him. He couldn't stand the thought of me getting any part of our business or my home or my social group, anything, or me telling my story. I think it was just he didn't want those things to happen, and I really think he started making hints that I should have listened to in hindsight about life insurance policies and things. And he had already strangled me a number of times by that point. He'd already started to show really it was coming. So when it did kind of come, the moment of which, a week prior to that, he was crying and begging and saying, "You are the only person in the world for me, and please, I love you. It's only ever been you. You're the only person I've ever loved." I mean, to say it's really awful going through these things. It's really awful. They will say and do anything, and they will completely tear you apart. And when that happened, the moment, I don't know, it's so shocking how invisible you become in lieu of this person that's quite literally parasitically taking from you, and it's a parasitical relationship. They are parasites. And I can't really even go into so much of what it was like to escape. I know that for a lot of people, it took up until the discard. And with me, it was the discard that really did it. And the discard is just when suddenly, remember how I talked about the empty eyes? And it's like that. It's just, I had gotten him out by that point into a different apartment. I had rescued the business from a certain collapse because of various things he had done. And he had triangulated and spun things enough that he had put everything, like it was, he had manipulated me to rescue him when I could have left him to drown. And as soon as that was over, and he had his advantage and he took it, it was like I didn't exist. It was literally like, which is very strange to go from this intensity, this massive manipulation, and having all this stuff just bombarding you all the time, and wanting so badly to save this person, and still believing, even after all of this, that this person can be rescued, or you perceive that they need to be rescued. And then suddenly it's like you don't exist. They don't bother. They're good. They manage to hook on to some kind of power source, some kind of supply, something. And then they don't need you anymore. And that was all it was. What's really hard for abuse survivors is we do not comprehend, we do not understand just how little we matter to them. We don't exist to them. We are them. We're just an extension of them. Every good thing they see in themselves, every bad thing they see in themselves, they discard us because we have no sovereignty. We are a disposable object, and it doesn't matter if it's been 5 months or 50 years. And it's so bizarre to think of another human being, thinking of another human being like that. It's so outside of normal. Like, could you imagine a father feeling that way about his child? And yet they do. They do. When you think about how much you love your children, and how you die often for your children, and then there's this other person that would feed it to a wolf if it threatened their supply. And it really is like that. It really, really, truly is like that. I know that's what he was. I don't have to prove to anybody or explain to anybody, because I know it. But, one of the things abuse survivors have to do, they have to do this, is stop caring about what other people think. Stop caring about telling them their story as I'm telling you my story. There's really no sense in it. I know it feels so unfair, but I know what he is, and I survived him. I don't think, I thought about, like, well, maybe I should show his mother, or maybe I should show, actually, like, just show it and be like, this is it, and, just put it out there and just be like, there, this, I will tell them. And I do want this person to be held accountable. I want people to know that I want people to know that abuse happens and that it can I just want people to feel less isolated. I've reached a point now, a year or so later, where I still think that he should be held accountable for what he did. I think that what he did were criminal acts. They were crimes. It's not so much because I need to feel I'm good. I'm happy. I'm supported. I'm connected to myself. The trauma has, in some ways, by this point, gotten me to a level of being more spiritually centered, being more connected to who I am. I think without this relationship, I would have always had issues with codependency. I would have always had issues with attachment issues and just various insecurities and things that would have impaired me from reaching my higher self and reaching, I think, a more admirable or attainable thing for me. And so this circumstance has, in some ways, I don't know, spiritually leveled me up maybe. I feel now more connected to myself and more forgiving, more loving, more charitable, more just I feel more at peace. It's nothing, I guess maybe, after you go through something like that and such an array of emotions and pain, you definitely become less affected by bad stuff. And you really do learn to embrace the beauty of life and embrace happiness and embrace relationships. And when somebody loves you or is kind to you, you really appreciate it. You appreciate it on a level you ever have before. You're so thankful to them. And it makes you want to be kind to them. And I am so good in so many ways. Once I got over the trauma, I think for me, for those that are recovering from what happened in your own versions, in your own lives, 6 months. I know that seems like forever. For me, at least, 6 months. 6 months was when, at the very least, I felt a shift, a turning point. Everybody has their own timelines. This might be silly for me to even try to create a timeline. But I do know that 6 months was enough time where I no longer felt it's duped sickness, just complete, emotionally drained, couldn't do anything other than survive and just go through basic functionalities. And with me, I mean, it was basic functionalities. I had to reteach myself how to brush my teeth. I had to reteach myself how to cook for myself and how to drive myself. Not literally reteach, but I had to start there, to get out of bed, to put on pants. And if eventually, though, especially if you use something to motivate yourself to get there, it helps. For me, a random one, and I probably will actually dive into this much more at a later podcast. A random one for me was tarot cards. Because what was happening in my mind after the discard and whatnot, I had to leave everything, my whole life, basically. And then coronavirus happened. And by my routine, my everything, it's all gone. And I'm used to being constantly hypervigilant, constantly stimulated, constantly, I went from checking social media things to to and then just because I had to do it, just nothing. And it's a lot of just whoa. And so I felt helpless. Helplessness, of course, was a big, big problem. Very, very helpless, very, very scared, very vulnerable. very despairing. Tarot cards gave me a feeling of control. And they gave me a feeling of stability whenever I would start to ruminate or I would start to have obsessive thinkings. I would pull out my deck, and I've been reading tarot since I was 20. So we'll just say it's been a little while. I don't need to age myself. I'm a millennial. I'll give you a hint. And I've been reading tarot cards for a pretty significant amount of time, and having them, even the ritual of shuffling them, and then also like reading them, doing the Celtic cross spread, doing a yes or no, whatever it was, it gave me a focus and a hope. It helped me put my feelings somewhere, and these were wild feelings. These were, I couldn't, most days I had a roommate, and I would just like kind of shuffle my tarot cards and just watch her play video games. That was all I could do, because anything else would cause me to shake. I'd have flashback after flashback after flashback after flashback. I didn't want to put that on a roommate. I'm already kind of like weird around her. She understood, fortunately, some of these things, and she was able to be pretty supportive about it. And I'm appreciative of that person for that. Usually on my bad flashback days, I just would stay in my room, or I would just sit and watch her play video games. And COVID, in some ways was an interesting time to hit, because that was about all I could do anyway. So it's like, well, I guess the world's going to join me. Anyway, now I got really personal. Tarot cards. The reason I might suggest someone do it, at least I know for me, you want answers. You want control. And they're not going to give it to you. The lack of closure can drive you crazy. It literally can drive you insane. And that's what they want you to be. They want you to be insane. They want to bait you. They want you to look crazy. That is their goal, because you're going to go crazy. How can you not? They are literally making you crazy. They are psychologically tormenting you until you break. And they, on the other hand, cool as a cucumber. It's fascinating. They can quite literally, and this is a real thing, they can quite literally beat a woman, and then a second later, turn their heads and say they see a person, their pastor, and they'll just be like, "Hi, Pastor Rick, how's it going?" And just they have no souls. I know that was a bit much, but my partner had no soul, and which is just so strange. I will tell you a story. I think this is a story, since I'm being personal, why not? When we were at a restaurant of sorts, we were sitting at a bar, and he was talking about, his beer and whatnot. And, we were eating our food, and a man collapsed over as he was exiting the restaurant. And his wife kept going. She didn't see or whatever. And anyway, when he collapsed, it was shocking. The whole room erupted. I instantly got off my stool because I was close to him. I pull out my cell phone. I have 911 dialed. I'm about ready to call a woman who's a nurse or medical profession. I shouldn't say nurse. That could be genderized. I think she was I don't know. She was some kind of medical professional. She instantly went down, started checking his vitals, etc. I had my phone, and because she holds up her hand, like, hold off on the phone, and all this stuff is happening, and everybody is just like acting, as people would in a crisis when a person collapses, right? The man is revived. He eventually comes to. He's had some kind of cardiac incident. He's older. He's probably like mid-60s, 70s. And, his wife comes back, and I still get a little teary-eyed when she came, she turned in, because all this is happening relatively quickly. He reaches his hand up to her and says her name in such a vulnerable way. That will always be an impression in my mind, because obviously he's scared, she's scared. So this happens, this very emotional experience, this very scary experience for an individual that I don't know. And, the medical professional, she tells him, hey, you've had a cardiac, an incident. You need to go to the hospital. Your wife can drive you, and you need to get this checked out because this is serious. And once all this is over and done, and again, it actually wasn't that long. It's hard to tell how long it was. It was a memory from a while ago. I go back to my stool, to the table where, my ex-abuser is sitting. And, I'm shaking. My heart is palpitating. I'm like, oh, my God, I hope he's okay. Oh, that was so scary. And he is nonplussed. He ignores me and just, without really skipping a beat, continues to explain to me kind of his thoughts on the beer he's drinking. And I only mention this story because I remember this being just a very strange moment, because I can't switch over into guilt and shame right now. Because usually I'd be like, oh, he doesn't want to talk about something. I'll just feel guilty and ashamed and change the subject. I can't do that at the moment. My whole mind and energy is shifted towards concern for this man. And also there's just a kind of certainty here that, no, this behavior isn't normal. What are you doing? Why are you changing this subject? A man collapsed in front of us, and you are showing no signs that you noticed it or even that you cared. I mean, he kind of noticed it, but it would be kind of like there was nobody around him to, I guess, pretend he had concern, and he didn't have concern. And in fact, he found it very annoying that I talked about it. And I think that's an illustration of an insight into who he was. But for the record, that person was then sealed away, and he's normal. Like, if I told that story to one of his friends, they wouldn't probably believe me, or they'd be like, well, you're probably exaggerating the story, or you're spinning it or something. He's pretty warm to me. But honestly, the really funny thing about abusive people is if you pay attention and you remove the assumptions we make, if we remove the assumptions, abusive, narcissistic, cluster B, psychopathic, sociopathic people, I think, really rely on our assumptions. We assume that they are like us. Or we say, like what I did, oh, he's just socially awkward. Oh, he's just a bit of a nerd. It's fine. While other people are like, that guy is cold and off-putting. I had one friend, met him just one time, and she was so turned off by the experience, like she actively avoided hanging out with him again. That actually became more getting out of the abuse. I had more people coming forward saying that to me. And I, of course, didn't know, and they were just like, yeah, it was very strange. But anyway, it's assumptions. We assume things. And I think his friends would assume, oh, well, because they weren't there, they didn't see his the complete apathy in his eyes like I did. And so they would just insert something else. And I would do it too. Like, this is not to say that I'm somehow, I do it too. When people tell me stories, I assume. Everybody does it. Everybody projects into stories. Everybody alters stories as they're being said to them. We change them to just help us. It is a human flaw. It's a flaw only because it's a distortion, and we're not really listening, and we're not really seeing. And I'm trying to be better myself about it and not insert my own biases and stories when I do listen to people. But I think that's just normal. That's just normal. And if I told people, like, say that story, they would just alter it like they would alter most anything. And that can be another problem when you are telling stories about abuse and about abuse recovery. There's also the whole people don't want the burden. They don't really want to care. And these could be friends. Some of this, like, it's talking to a friend, a person, say, that you've had a close relationship with for 5-7 years. At that moment that maybe you open up and you share to them, it can be very heartbreaking, because they may, and they probably will, disappoint you. That's why I like to say, when you're first going through abuse recovery, try to limit who you talk to strictly your closest friends and family. Like, I would just say maybe your mother, if you get along with your mother, or maybe your best friend. as few people as you can and as close of a person as you can, because you're not going to be making a lot of sense probably when you're just getting out. You're going to be all over the place. Your stories are going to be jumbled. Your emotions are going to be very high, very low. Probably you're going to look bipolar, very common, especially because you're going to probably have severe trauma, PTSD for sure, horrific flashbacks. It's a lot. It's a roller coaster. And you can be very off-putting, and you will lose friendships if you do not just limit. And, maybe those friendships needed to be shedded. I would also say getting out of abuse, usually when you recover from it a little bit, you are not going to be able to go back to a lot of your relationships, even if you wanted to, because you're so different. And relationships often are a reflection of us. And so it's just going to be a part of that, being a little isolated and alone. But it's how you choose to look at it. And when you recover, or when you I kind of lost my train. I suppose I'm just saying to keep the faith, and don't care in the beginning about telling people your story. I know that's what you want to do. I know that's what you feel you need to do. Most people do not have it within them to help you, and you're going to have to help yourself. I would quite literally just mostly talk it out with myself. I would talk it out just with me. If need be, whenever I needed to talk, I would get the urge to talk to my abuser. How could you? Because, there's no point. I was never able to communicate how I felt to him in a decade. It wasn't going to start. All he was going to do if I told him, these horrible things happened and this is my recovery, if I told him, these horrible things happened and this is my recovery, his response would be he would mimic everything I just said and tell his friends and family that these were what he's experiencing. And he's done this many, many times. He can only mimic human emotions. And it's weird being out, because to me it's now so obvious that he only has about 3 or 4 of them. And he just kind of recycles them, and it's kind of it really is like watching a robot trying to mimic a human, and then there's just these little tells that give it away. I'm being a little cruel, but also I'm not. As an abuse survivor, I know this. I've had to observe and live with a person that in some ways I know better. No, I know this man better than anyone on the planet, because I had to. My survival depended on it. And so when people try to tell me, well, you just don't know him, I'm like, oh, I do. Oh, well, you're just angry at him. Well, yes, I am. The attempted murder tends to do that to people. But I'm not going to pretend I'm not angry. I'm not going to pretend I'm not humiliated. But I will say that I no longer think about him as him. I think about him as almost this abstraction, this entity out there. He is no longer a personal connection to me as much. Now my connection is to solely me and my relationships and who I choose to have in my world. And that came about a year later, and through a lot of talk therapy, through a lot of trials and errors and mistakes, a lot of mistakes. I made so many mistakes while healing. And again, just forgive yourself. And maybe then also be forgiving of other people's when they make mistakes too. I am so happy how I don't live in resistance to things as much anymore. I don't want to portray myself as having all my shit together. I still struggle with reestablishing my career, with maintaining new relationships, with healthy routines. I mean, I'm still far from where I need to be, but I do want to tell you guys there is a light at the end of the tunnel. And that's kind of a little bit of my story and sort of what happened to me. And you guys are worthy. I do want to kind of let you know that, like, you're worthy. You are not responsible for what he or she did to you. I really feel like it takes a long time to stop feeling responsible for them. To feel like if you had just, then they would have. If you had only, then they would have. Well, maybe it's my fault that, because it's not your fault. You're not responsible. Yes, I am confident you fucked up at some point. Welcome to being human. Who hasn't messed up? Who hasn't been selfish? Who hasn't, embarrassed themselves and done shameful acts out of vengeance and shallowness and anger and cruelty and rage? We all have done this. And it doesn't make you a damnable person. I guarantee you, though, that your abuser will not change. And your abuser is solely responsible for what they were doing. And you were not wrong. You were not wrong for advocating for yourself. Because I think most of the reasons that we are here now, I'm talking to abuse recoverers, people who are hopefully outside of the relationship, or maybe are getting ready to. The reason you're out is typically because you started to fight. And you fought. And nobody may ever know how much strength that took. I know how much strength it took for me, and I know how scary abuse is, and I can tell you that I am proud of you for that courage, because it is courage, and it's so much courage. And people who look at abuse survivors and say, wow, they're weak, because they're like, why would they have been abused? It's like, why would they stay in abuse? They must be weak. Or, wow, they're liars. Well, they can't be telling the truth, because there's just no way that someone like them, or that just doesn't make logical sense to me. It's somebody who's never experienced it. I would say that you are deeply strong, and you are very truthful. And coming out the other side, I think you'll become more truthful. I've found myself now very aware of my words, and very aware of my deeds and my intentions and how I communicate. And it's made me, I think, a more truthful person, because I understand now the poisonous effect just little white lies can have, and why we do it, because it's usually based around insecurity and fear and ego and things of that nature. And so much of it's pointless, because if you want to live a healthy life with people who you feel connected to, being vulnerable and honest are the two ways to do it. And you have to be comfortable with yourself, because if you are vulnerable and honest, and the person takes that vulnerability and honesty and they crumple it up in a ball and say, yeah, I don't like that. When you feel a sense of security and centeredness in who you are, and self-love in who you are, it doesn't hurt you. It doesn't affect you. Suddenly you realize, well, I'm not responsible for that person. I'm not. Why does their reaction even merit me feeling hurt by it? I am living my truth, and I'm living what works for me and what feels right for me. And, it's a wonderful feeling and honesty is such an important part, I think, to being alive and happy and recover from abuse. I think that we can select what we talk about. I still struggle with, it's still a part of my life. It's still a defining part of my life. I'm still trying to rebuild and have other memories, other things to talk about, other relationships and situations and things of that nature. But I will talk about it when it feels, I'm starting to learn what's appropriate and what's not. For a while there, I was talking about it too much. I was just being too much in a lot of respects. Now I do bring it up sometimes, but it's I have enough I have other things in my life I can talk about. And I don't feel the urge as much to talk about it, which is also a great feeling, that I don't even have an urge. Because that urge at first was built on, oh God, please validate me. Oh God, I'm so scared, I'm so alone. Which, again, that's a lot. And that's because I was in a lot of pain. But now, you don't need to validate me. I've made a lot of strides in this, and I've come to peace with this in some respects. I still feel a strong urge to hold that man accountable. I do still think that I do, only because I really am a justice-oriented person, and if this had been done to a friend or a family member, I would be pretty hell-bent on it, especially maybe because of who I am. And I think that all of our abusers should be held accountable. They should see consequences to their actions. I also believe that we can wish for those things and not have it impede our own recovery and life. There's little to no point in ruminating over it if we don't have the ability to do anything about it, or if we're too damaged and in pain to effectively battle it out. Like, you're bruised, you're battered, you're bleeding. Like, it's like, stop trying to wield the sword. Go home, recover, heal. And if you feel the urge to charge in there, to expose this dragon, this demon, through legal channels and just make sure you're healed first. I don't know what I don't know what I plan to say or do if there is ever a situation where someone wants to hear my story. I am still taking each day as it comes. And I'm not afraid of my rapist anymore. I'm not afraid of the man who beat me anymore. I'm not afraid of him. Because I finally know what is real and what is true. And for the longest time, I didn't. I couldn't figure out where he began and I ended, what was his guilt and what was my guilt, whether I was even justified in feeling pain. And I no longer have that confusion. I'm no longer brainwashed like that. And so I'm not really afraid of him. He already made his best attempts. I won't let him ever again enter into my life and disrupt it. It's a wonderful, empowering feeling. And I hope every single one of you reach that. And that we can all arrive at a more enlightened and happy place in our lives post what happened to us. And I also, on a spiritual level, and this is completely spiritual, and I'm cool with doing things on the physical plane and being like, yeah, spiritual's great, but that man should be arrested. Spiritually speaking, I do believe that when we remove ourselves from them and no longer keep inheriting their karma, like, remember what I said about how they become, it's like, I am your God, I am your community, and they siphon our energy into them. Once we wrestle that away and we take that siphon, and instead of putting it into God and country, you know what I suggest? Putting it into yourself and refueling yourself. And once you start doing that and just really taking it back, and he's going to try to connect to other fuel sources, other supply, and he might succeed. He might. But karma does get to him. It does. He can keep trying to throw other people into its path. They can keep trying to dump it into other individuals that they see as themselves. You know, they really see us like dumpsters, and like they're just like, oh, here's a piece of trash inside of me. Here's a piece of trash. I'm just going to dump it into that person. I'm going to dump it into that person. Oh, and this person I need adoration and attention from, so I'm going to do this and that. I mean, that's just how they think, and we all kind of know how they think, because every human being has, like, you know, on our more selfish forms, like, know these thought processes. It's just that they think of it in such a monstrous way. The point is eventually karma comes to them. It does. It inevitably does. People get fed up with selfishness. They get fed up with one-sidedness. Turn left onto Bridge Street. It will happen, and I hope it happens for you guys, and I hope you see the karma. Just be patient. I know that my ex is going to get karma. I know that's coming any day now, and I look forward to one day sharing it with you. For now, I am Lyra Stone. You are listening to My Little Narcissist.